the summer of 1996, the small town of Norwood, Pennsylvania was unusually tense. It wasn't the kind of place where big city headlines ever reached, but that year was different. News vans rolled in, strangers asked too many questions, and for the first time everyone in town knew the same name: Michael Travers, a respected defense attorney who had suddenly vanished without a trace. Michael was known for his calm voice, sharp mind, and strong sense of justice. He wasn't a flashy lawyer, not the kind you'd see on television, but people trusted him. He had worked quietly for years, helping families with legal troubles, defending workers who couldn't afford high-profile firms. But in early 1996, he took on a case that changed everything: a corporate whistleblower lawsuit involving one of the state's biggest construction companies. Locals didn't know much about that case, only that it involved millions of dollars and powerful people in the city. Michael had been working long hours, often seen leaving his small downtown office late at night with stacks of papers under his arm. His wife, Linda, once told a neighbor that Michael had become unusually quiet in those last few weeks. Distracted, cautious, and easily startled by noises outside their home. On the morning of June 17, 1996, Michael was scheduled to appear in Harrisburg for a pretrial hearing. He left home around 7 a.m., carrying his brown leather briefcase, a thermos of coffee, and a folder marked "Confidential." His wife remembered the quick goodbye kiss before he left. He told her he might be home late but didn't explain why. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. By noon, when Michael didn't show up at court, his assistant began calling his car phone. No answer. At first, people thought he might have had car trouble, but by evening his family grew worried. He hadn't returned home and his phone was still off. Linda called the police to report him missing. Just before midnight, officers found Michael's car on an old service road about 10 miles from town. The engine was still running, headlights on, driver's door wide open. His briefcase was missing, but his wallet, watch, and glasses were still inside the car. It looked as if he had stepped out for a moment and simply disappeared into thin air. The road where they found the car led into a wooded area, the kind of quiet place hunters used in the fall. But few people visited in summer. Officers searched the woods through the night, using flashlights and calling his name, but found nothing except footprints that disappeared into the mud. News spread quickly the next morning. Reporters arrived, helicopters hovered, and everyone in Norwood had their own version of what might have happened. Some said he'd been kidnapped. Others whispered that he ran away with money from the case. A few even believed he was hiding because he'd uncovered something dangerous. The police formed a task force within days. They interviewed everyone: his colleagues, his family, even clients from older cases. No one had any clue. Michael had no debts, no enemies, no signs of wanting to leave. His wife was heartbroken. His teenage daughter refused to speak for days. Neighbors brought food to their doorstep but didn't know what to say. Then came a strange discovery. A gas station security camera, located about 6 miles from where his car was found, showed Michael's car passing by around 8:15 a.m. that morning. But another vehicle, a dark blue sedan, was seen following close behind. Investigators couldn't make out the license plate clearly because of glare, and that tape later went missing from the evidence room. The police claimed it was misplaced, but people in town weren't so sure. Over the next few weeks, search teams combed through the forests, rivers, and old quarries nearby. They brought in dogs, divers, and even used helicopters with heat sensors, but there was no sign of Michael or his briefcase. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The case made regional headlines for months. Reporters stood outside the courthouse asking questions nobody could answer. A few people even came forward claiming they'd seen him at rest stops or small towns across the state, but none of those sightings were ever confirmed. Linda continued to call his office every morning for months, listening to his voicemail greeting just to hear his voice. His desk remained untouched, papers still in neat piles, his pen lying exactly where he had left it. She refused to believe he was gone. As the months passed, police interest began to fade. Without new leads, the task force was slowly reduced to a single detective who checked in occasionally. By the end of 1997, the case was officially labeled cold, but not everyone moved on. Michael's best friend, a retired reporter named Tom Garrison, couldn't let it go. He had known Michael since college, and he didn't believe the theories floating around. He started digging into the last case Michael had been working on, the corporate whistleblower one. It involved allegations of money laundering, construction fraud, and illegal political donations. The deeper Tom looked, the more strange connections he found between the company and a few government officials. When he tried to get access to certain public records, he was told they'd been sealed for security reasons. When he asked questions in town, people grew uncomfortable. Someone even left a note on his doorstep one night that said, "Stop asking about Travers." Tom didn't stop, but he became more careful. He believed Michael had found something that someone didn't want revealed. And whatever that was, it had cost him his life. Meanwhile, Michael's family struggled to rebuild. Linda sold their home and moved closer to her sister's house in another state. His daughter finished school quietly and never spoke to the press. For years, the case sat buried in the back of dusty filing cabinets, a forgotten mystery. Still, some residents never forgot. Every now and then, hikers exploring the woods near where his car was found would stumble upon something odd. An old shoe, a rusted thermos, a torn piece of cloth. Each time, police would check it out, but none of it ever led to anything. In 2000, a new detective briefly reopened the case after an anonymous tip claimed Michael had been seen alive in Canada. The lead turned out to be false, but the renewed attention brought back painful memories. Linda, still wearing her wedding ring, told a reporter, "I don't care about rumors. I just want to know what happened to him." By 2002, the story was practically forgotten. The younger generation in Norwood barely knew his name. The old gas station where the video had been recorded closed down, and the building became an empty shell covered in vines. The forest grew thicker, swallowing up the old road where his car had been found. It became one of those local legends older folks told during long winter nights, the lawyer who vanished and was never found. But something about that stretch of woods made people uneasy. Hunters claimed their dogs refused to go near the old mine entrance nearby. Locals said strange noises could be heard at night, faint echoes like someone calling for help deep underground. Most brushed it off as imagination, but a few believed it was Michael's spirit still trying to tell his story. Years passed. The town changed, the roads got repaved, and people stopped talking about him altogether. But fate has a way of bringing forgotten truths back to light. 7 years after Michael's disappearance, 3 local boys exploring those same woods on a summer afternoon would stumble upon something that would change everything, and finally reopen a mystery the town thought it had buried forever. For 7 long years, the mystery of Michael Travers's disappearance had faded into quiet whispers. Life in Norwood slowly returned to normal. The old case files gathered dust in police storage. Most people had stopped asking questions, believing some things were better left alone. But on a warm afternoon in July 2003, 3 boys from the nearby neighborhood decided to go exploring. They were around 12 or 13 years old, the kind of age where curiosity is stronger than fear. Summer vacation had made them restless, and their favorite thing to do was wander through the woods near the old service road, the same one where Michael's car had been found years before. They had heard stories from older kids, tales of ghosts, hidden tunnels, and strange lights in the forest. They didn't believe most of it, but adventure was adventure. They packed a flashlight, some snacks, and one of their father's old walkie-talkies, just in case they got separated. As they wandered deeper into the trees, they came across an old, overgrown path. It was barely visible under years of leaves and moss, but something about it drew them in. The path led them to a collapsed structure covered in vines and dirt. It looked like the entrance to an old mine shaft, narrow, dark, and half buried by rocks. At first, they just threw stones inside and listened for echoes, laughing when they bounced off the walls. But when one of the boys shone his flashlight deeper, he noticed something shiny wedged behind a pile of stones, something metallic. Curiosity got the better of them. They started moving the loose rocks one by one until they uncovered an old, rusted briefcase. The latch was broken and the surface was covered in mud and corrosion. When they finally pulled it free, it was heavier than they expected. They carried it outside where the sunlight could reach, brushing off the dirt. The lock had long since rusted away, so one of them pried it open carefully with a stick. Inside were several papers soaked and stuck together from years of moisture. There was also a cassette tape in a cracked plastic case and what looked like an old tie, dark red, stained and faded with age. At first, they didn't realize what they'd found. To them, it was just a weird box full of junk. But when one of the boys noticed faint writing on a water-damaged paper, The name Trevor. They froze. Everyone in town had heard the name Travers. Even though they were too young to remember the disappearance, their parents had told the story. The boys didn't say much to each other. They just knew they needed to show someone. They carefully carried the briefcase back to town and turned it in at the local sheriff's office. Within hours, word spread like wildfire. By evening, the same police department that had nearly forgotten the case was swarming with reporters again. For the first time in years, the name Michael Travers appeared in headlines. Investigators reopened the case immediately. The briefcase was sent to a lab for testing, and the papers were carefully separated and dried. Even though much of the writing had faded, forensic experts managed to recover fragments of notes, typed documents, and handwritten pages. What they found shocked everyone. The notes mentioned financial transactions, coded names, and meeting dates. Some pages had sketches of office buildings and initials that matched executives from the same construction company Michael had been investigating before he disappeared. Then there was the cassette tape. It took technicians several tries to restore the sound, since the tape had been damaged by water and time. But after a week of careful cleaning, they managed to play part of it. The audio was grainy, full of static, but two voices could be heard. One of them, according to experts who compared it to Michael's old recordings, was indeed his. The other voice remained unidentified. The conversation was short, barely 2 minutes long, but chilling. It began with Michael saying something about having enough evidence and needing to get this to the press before it's too late. Then the other man's voice interrupted, low and firm, saying, "You're making a mistake. You don't know who you're dealing with." The tape ended with what sounded like a car door closing and muffled footsteps. When this was revealed to the public, the story exploded again. Television stations covered it for weeks. Journalists camped outside the police building, hoping for new updates. People who had long forgotten the name Travers started to wonder if the old rumors were true. Had he been silenced because he knew too much? Detectives began re-interviewing witnesses from the original case. Some were harder to find now. A few had moved away, others had retired, and a couple of key people had passed away. Still, they managed to track down Michael's former assistant, who remembered him being unusually nervous in his final days. She recalled that he had been planning to meet someone privately the morning he disappeared, someone who claimed to have inside information. The assistant said she never learned who that person was, only that Michael seemed both hopeful and frightened about the meeting. He had told her, "Once I have this last piece, everything will make sense." Investigators also revisited the old whistleblower case, the one Michael had been handling. To their surprise, many of the documents related to that case were missing from public archives. Files that should have been preserved were marked as restricted access. When police tried to obtain them, they were told the records had been transferred years ago but could not be located. Still, the new detective assigned to the reopened case, a calm, methodical man who had grown up in Norwood, refused to give up. He believed the briefcase had been hidden, not lost, and that whoever placed it there had wanted it to be found one day. Forensic teams returned to the mine area where the boys had made their discovery. They scanned the ground with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar. About 20 yards from the entrance, they found a shallow depression in the earth that looked disturbed, as if it had once been dug and refilled. Inside, they discovered several small metal fragments, possibly parts of a vehicle, but nothing that clearly connected to Michael. Meanwhile, the boys who found the briefcase became local heroes. Reporters wanted interviews, teachers praised their honesty, and for a brief time the little town of Norwood was back in the national spotlight. But behind all the excitement, there was also unease. People who had once worked for the same construction company began receiving anonymous phone calls warning them not to talk. A retired clerk who had handled legal documents for the company was found to have packed up and left town overnight. It was as if the ghosts of the old case were waking up again. Michael's wife, Linda, who had been living quietly out of state, returned to Norwood for the first time in years. She attended the police briefing in person and held the briefcase in her hands. She broke down when she saw his handwriting on the papers. "I knew he wouldn't run away," she said softly to the reporters. He was trying to do the right thing. Her words reignited sympathy across the state. People started demanding answers. lawmakers called for a new investigation into the company Michael had once fought against. A few journalists from larger networks began looking into political donations and contracts that had been signed in the late 90s. But the more they uncovered, the murkier things became. A few records hinted that Michael might have been on the verge of exposing a network of illegal kickbacks involving several state officials and business owners. Some of those individuals were still in positions of influence. The town's atmosphere changed again, a mix of hope and tension. Everyone wanted the truth, but some feared what it would cost to find it. One night, about a month after the discovery, the detective working the case received an anonymous letter. It contained no name or return address, just a single piece of paper with the words, "Look where the water meets the rock." He didn't go far. The message made little sense at first, but the next morning, the detective visited the area near the old mine, where a small stream ran through the forest and disappeared beneath a limestone ridge. The ground was uneven and slippery, but he noticed something odd, a small opening partially hidden by roots and stones, leading deeper underground. He marked the spot and called for a team. The search that followed would reveal something no one in Norwood was prepared for, but that discovery would come later. For now, all the town knew was that the truth, whatever it was, had begun to stir again after 7 long years of silence. The morning after the detective received that mysterious letter, the town of Norwood woke up to another wave of quiet curiosity. The story of the briefcase had already stirred up old memories, but now, with the new clue, people began to wonder if the missing attorney might finally be found after all these years. The detective didn't tell anyone at first what the letter said. He didn't want to start rumors or attract media to the area. He only told 2 officers he trusted and returned to the forest early that morning, before sunrise. The air was cool, mist hung low over the trees, and the path to the old mine felt eerily quiet. When they reached the spot mentioned in the letter, where the stream met the limestone ridge in the O, detective noticed how the water disappeared into a small gap in the rocks. It didn't look like much, maybe 2 feet wide, almost hidden under roots and mud, but when he cleared some debris away, he realized it was actually a narrow tunnel leading underground. The 3 men brought in lights, ropes, and a small camera used for tight spaces. They lowered it into the opening and guided it forward slowly. The feed on their screen showed a damp, uneven passage with dripping water and bits of old timber. It went deeper than they expected, bending slightly to the left. After a few minutes, the camera caught something strange, a glint of metal and what looked like pieces of old fabric stuck to a rock wall. The detective felt his stomach tighten. They stopped the feed and decided to widen the entrance just enough to go inside safely. By afternoon, a full search team had arrived with protective gear. The town soon noticed the commotion, and word spread fast that police were back in the woods. Reporters started gathering near the old service road, cameras ready while curious locals watched from a distance. The tunnel turned out to be part of an old drainage system that had been forgotten for decades. It stretched beneath the forest and connected to a larger chamber carved out of the rock. Inside that chamber, the air was still and cold. Water dripped from the ceiling, echoing in the silence. Then one of the officers found something partially buried in silt, a piece of torn cloth that looked like part of a jacket. Nearby, they discovered a metal pen, the kind used by lawyers, and a faded leather wallet. When they opened it, the ID card inside was still readable. It belonged to Michael Travers. The area was immediately sealed off. The detective stood quietly, looking at the wallet in his hands, realizing the years of wondering might soon come to an end. But at the same time, he knew this discovery was only the beginning of a bigger story. The team carefully searched the chamber and eventually found skeletal remains buried under a thin layer of soil and rock. Forensic specialists were called in, and every piece of evidence was photographed and cataloged. Next to the remains was a small metal keychain engraved with the initials MT, and a ring that had once been gold, now dull from years underground. By evening, the detective called Linda, Michael's wife, and told her they had likely found him. She didn't speak for a moment, just breathed softly over the phone. "I always knew he didn't just walk away," she whispered. The official identification would take a few days, but everyone in Norwood already knew. The missing attorney had finally been found, 7 years after he vanished. When the news broke, it hit the town like a storm. Reporters filled the streets again and camera crews crowded the courthouse steps. Some residents stood in small groups, quietly talking about how strange it was that all this time he had been so close. Just a few miles from where his car was left running, his body had been hidden underground, forgotten by everyone. But the question remained, how did he end up there? The autopsy report revealed that there were no clear signs of struggle on the bones, but traces of metal and old fibers suggested he might have been struck on the head before death. The exact cause couldn't be confirmed due to the condition of the remains, but it ruled out any natural accident. Investigators began re-examining every piece of evidence: the briefcase, the cassette tape, and now the remains. The tape, once thought to be just a random warning, now seemed like a clue left behind intentionally. Some experts believed Michael had secretly recorded his last meeting, and the tape survived because it had been sealed inside his briefcase before he disappeared. The detective also found something new near the remains: a small, rusted key with a tag that had faded numbers on it, possibly belonging to a storage locker or safe. He sent it for analysis, hoping it might unlock something left behind years ago. Meanwhile, Linda organized a small memorial service in town. It wasn't public, just close friends, family, and a few of Michael's old colleagues. They gathered quietly in the local church. She placed his ring and wallet on the table beside a framed photo of him smiling. In her short speech, she said, "He was a good man who believed truth always wins." Maybe it took time, but he was right. The truth always finds its way out. People cried, some out of sorrow, others out of relief. For years, the mystery had haunted them. Now they finally had a piece of closure. But behind the calm surface of the town, something else was brewing. A retired journalist, Tom Garrison, the same man who had once investigated Michael's case years earlier, came forward again. He had kept copies of old articles, notes, and letters from that time. He told the detective he believed Michael had hidden one more piece of evidence before he vanished, something that could connect everything together. Tom said Michael once mentioned a safe place where he kept documents separate from his office, something about, "If anything happens to me, they'll know where to look." But he had never explained where that was. The detective listened carefully. He decided to cross-check property records, storage units, and old bank files under Michael's name. Days later, he found an old rental record from 1996, a storage locker registered under his initials at a facility just outside the city. When officers arrived, the locker was still there, covered in dust but locked tight. The small rusted key found near the body fit perfectly. Inside were several boxes filled with files, cassette tapes, and a typewriter that looked well used. Among the papers was one envelope marked "For the Record." Inside was a typed statement signed by Michael himself. In it, he detailed everything he had discovered in the corruption case: names, payments, bank transfers, and connections between business owners and government contracts. He had written that he feared for his life after receiving threats but couldn't walk away without finishing what he started. The detective felt a chill reading the pages. Everything pointed to one truth: Michael had uncovered evidence too dangerous for him to keep. Someone must have found out and stopped him before he could go public. The report was immediately handed to the state attorney's office. Within weeks, new investigations began into several companies that had once been considered untouchable. The story spread far beyond Norwood. Even though Michael was gone, his work had finally reached the light. He had left behind enough proof to shake the very people who once silenced him. For the first time, Linda allowed herself to smile through her tears.
"He always said the truth would find its way," she told a reporter.
It just took 7 years to catch up. But for the detective, there was one question that still haunted him. If the person who sent that anonymous letter hadn't come forward, would Michael ever have been found? Who had written those words? "Look where the water meets the rock." And why choose that moment after all these years? He went back to the letter, studying the handwriting over and over. It was neat, steady, and written on plain paper. There were no fingerprints. Whoever sent it had known exactly where to look, and perhaps had known the truth all along. As the sun set over Norwood that evening, the detective stood near the forest edge, watching the light fade through the trees. The place that had once hidden a man's secret now stood silent, as if the earth itself had finally given up what it had been holding for so long. The story wasn't over. Justice was only beginning to unfold. And the quiet town of Norwood would soon learn that when secrets stay buried too long, they have a way of resurfacing, piece by piece, truth by truth. The town of Norwood had barely begun to breathe again when new questions started rising. Michael Travers's body had been found, his documents had exposed deep corruption, and his story had reached newspapers across the state. But for the people who had known him, something still didn't sit right. The files in the storage locker had revealed more than anyone expected. There were letters between company executives, photocopies of checks, and handwritten notes linking several public officials to suspicious payments. Each piece of paper felt like a missing puzzle finally snapping into place. But one thing stood out. A small note in Michael's handwriting that read, "If anything happens to me, the truth is in two parts." The detective who had led the search couldn't stop thinking about that line. They had found one set of documents in the locker, but what if there was another? What if part of the truth was still out there, hidden, just like the briefcase had been? He went through every page again, searching for patterns or hints. On the last few sheets, he noticed small markings at the bottom, coordinates maybe, or coded numbers. It wasn't clear what they meant, but they seemed too deliberate to be random. Meanwhile, the discovery had shaken powerful people outside of Norwood. A few names mentioned in the documents were now facing serious investigations. Some denied everything. Others stayed quiet. The news stations kept replaying old footage of Michael from past interviews, painting him as a man who had tried to stand up against corruption, but paid the ultimate price for it. Linda, his wife, stayed away from cameras. She spent most days at home, going through her husband's old belongings. She found photos from vacations, notes he had written for her, even old letters he had sent during college. In one of those letters, he had written something that now seemed haunting. If truth is hidden too long, it starts to rot everything around it. It was strange how those words seemed to fit everything that was happening. The detective visited her one afternoon to ask if Michael had ever mentioned a second hiding place or any other location he trusted. She thought for a while and then remembered something small, a cabin. Years ago, before they married, Michael had bought a small property near a lake about an hour away. It was a quiet retreat, somewhere he went to think or work alone. The detective checked property records. The cabin was still listed under Michael's name, untouched for years. The next morning, he drove out there with a small team. The cabin sat at the edge of a calm lake surrounded by pine trees, almost like a picture from another time. Dust covered the windows and cobwebs hung near the door, but everything was still intact. Inside, it looked like Michael had left in a hurry. Papers were scattered across the desk. A cup was still on the table and a stack of files sat near the fireplace. Most of it had aged poorly, water damage, mold, and dust. But there was one thing that caught the detective's attention. On a shelf behind the desk was a wooden box with a small lock. The lock had rusted, so they broke it open gently. Inside was a cassette tape, another one, labeled only with a date, June 16, 1996. That was the day before Michael disappeared. The tape was taken back to the lab for restoration. When it was finally played, the sound was faint but clear enough to make out parts of a conversation. Michael's voice could be heard again, calmer this time, speaking as if he was recording a personal note. He said he had gathered enough evidence to expose several people involved in illegal contracts, but he was worried someone close to him might be leaking information. He mentioned being followed and that his phone lines felt different, as if someone was listening. He ended the recording with a quiet sigh, saying, "If anything happens, they'll come for the files first. The rest will have to find its way." The detective listened in silence. This second tape confirmed what everyone already feared. Michael had known he was in danger. But the recording also gave new leads. He had mentioned meeting someone from the inside who promised to hand over final proof. That meeting had likely been the one on the morning of his disappearance. But who was that person? The detective began re-examining all the names from the case. One name kept coming up, a project manager who had worked for the construction company during the scandal. He had resigned suddenly in 1996 and vanished from public view soon after. When police tried to locate him, they discovered he had moved abroad years ago, living quietly under a different name. After weeks of back-and-forth communication through legal channels, they managed to reach him. When questioned, the man admitted he had been afraid to come forward back then. He said he and Michael had met secretly to exchange documents the morning he disappeared. But before they could leave the parking area, two men in a dark sedan arrived. He had panicked and driven off, leaving Michael behind. He claimed he never went to the police because he was threatened days later. His confession fit the timeline. It explained the missing hours and why Michael's car was found running with the door open. Still, the detective needed proof. The man agreed to send over an old notebook, where he had written down dates, payment details, and even sketches of people involved. It matched what Michael had recorded. When all of this was compiled together, the full story began to take shape. Michael had been trying to protect evidence that implicated a network of businessmen and officials who had been covering up illegal contracts. Someone inside that circle had found out and acted before he could reveal it. Even after all those years, pieces of his work kept leading investigators to new truths. By now, Norwood had become famous for the story. Documentaries were being filmed, journalists filled the diner every morning, and people from neighboring towns came just to visit the places connected to the case. But for the locals, the attention was bittersweet. They had lived with the mystery, the fear, and the silence for too long. Linda decided to visit the cabin one last time after the investigation team had finished there. She stood by the window overlooking the lake, remembering how Michael used to sit there for hours thinking quietly. She left a single white flower on the desk before locking the door again. "I think he'd be at peace now," she said softly when the detective asked if she was okay. "He always believed that truth doesn't die even when people do." The detective nodded, but deep inside he still had doubts. Someone had sent that anonymous letter. Look where the water meets the rock. Whoever that was, they knew exactly where Michael had been hidden, and they had chosen to reveal it only when the time was right. Late one evening, long after the reporters had gone home, the detective sat alone in his office, looking at the old briefcase, the two tapes, and the notes. There was something poetic about how all the pieces had connected, one step at a time, years apart, led by small hints and quiet courage. He realized that maybe someone out there had been helping all along, protecting Michael's secret until it was safe to tell the world. That night, the detective drove out to the forest one last time. He parked near the old service road and walked to the stream under the moonlight. The water shimmered as it ran over the rocks. He knelt down, placed a small flashlight near the edge, and just listened. The forest was quiet now, peaceful, like it was finally at rest. For a long time he stood there thinking about how one man's determination had shaken an entire system. Michael might not have lived to see justice served, but his courage had started something that couldn't be buried again. Back in town, people began talking less about the mystery and more about what it represented: honesty, persistence, and the belief that even one person could make a difference. In the courthouse lobby, they placed a small plaque with his name engraved on it. It read simply, "In memory of a man who sought the truth and never stopped believing in it." The story that had once divided the town now brought it together. Still, the detective couldn't shake the feeling that there was one last chapter waiting to be told. That someone, somewhere, still held a secret about that day in 1996. But for now, Norwood could rest. The truth had surfaced, the silence was broken, and Michael Travers's story had finally found its voice again. Months passed after the last discovery. The story of Michael Travers had finally begun to settle, but the waves it created kept moving far beyond Norwood. Investigations opened in nearby cities, and a few powerful figures quietly resigned. Newspapers followed every update, but for the people who had lived through it, the story wasn't about scandals anymore. It was about a man who refused to give up on what was right. The detective who had worked on the case spent most of his days now finishing paperwork and giving statements. He had never sought fame, but people often stopped him on the street to thank him for not giving up. He always said the same thing: "It wasn't just me. The truth was always there. It just needed someone to keep looking." Life in Norwood slowly returned to normal. The crowds of reporters left, the news vans disappeared, and the town's quiet rhythm came back. The woods near the old service road grew thick again, and the mine entrance, once filled with police and cameras, was sealed for safety. But something about the town had changed. People talked more openly about honesty, about courage, about doing what was right even when no one was watching. The local school even added a small section in its library about Michael's case. Not as a mystery, but as a lesson about integrity. Linda spent her days quietly. Sometimes she would walk to the courthouse where Michael's plaque stood, gently touch the engraved letters and smile faintly. She never remarried. Her house was filled with photos and letters, pieces of their life before everything changed. She often said she didn't feel alone anymore, that knowing the truth had finally brought her peace. The detective, however, still thought often about the anonymous letter. Look where the water meets the rock. He had gone over it countless times, wondering who might have written it. It wasn't signed, and the paper carried no fingerprints. Whoever it was, they had been close enough to know everything but quiet enough to stay hidden all those years. One cold autumn evening, he received a small envelope in his office mail slot. It had no name, just his address typed neatly. Inside was a short note written in the same handwriting as the first letter. It said, "Some truths find you only when they know you're ready to listen. Thank you for listening." There was no return address, no name, nothing else inside. He read it several times, then folded it carefully and placed it inside his case file. He didn't tell anyone about it, not even Linda. Somehow it felt like the story had finally spoken for itself. Over time, people started sharing their own memories of Michael. One man remembered how he had once defended him for free when he couldn't afford a lawyer. A woman recalled how Michael had stood by her brother when no one else would. Dozens of stories like that came out, each one painting a picture of a man who cared deeply about others. The town decided to hold a small event in his memory one spring. It wasn't grand, just a gathering in the park near the courthouse. Children sang, candles were lit, and people told short stories about how truth can sometimes take years to surface but still finds its way. When it was Linda's turn to speak, she didn't bring notes. She just looked around at everyone and said quietly, "Michael believed that silence protects lies and that every truth deserves a voice. I think he'd be proud of this town for giving his truth a voice again." The crowd stayed silent for a moment, then softly clapped. There were no loud cheers, just quiet respect. After the event ended, the detective walked toward the forest path one more time. The sun was setting, and the sky glowed orange through the trees. He stood at the same stream where Michael's body had once been found, listening to the sound of the water. The place didn't feel dark anymore. It felt calm, as if the forest had been carrying the weight of the secret for too long and was finally free. He thought about everything that had happened, how 3 young boys had stumbled upon a rusted briefcase that reopened, a story buried for years, how one anonymous letter had led to the truth, and how one man's voice, even silenced, had spoken louder than all the lies that tried to bury it. That night, when he returned home, the detective opened his old notebook and wrote one final entry under the case name, "The Travers File." He wrote, "The truth always finds a way. Sometimes it takes 7 years, sometimes it takes longer, but it never disappears. It waits for the right hands to uncover it." He closed the book and never opened it again. Years went by. The children who had found the briefcase grew up. Each of them went on to different paths. One became a teacher, one joined the police academy, and one moved to another state to work in journalism. They always said that Day in the Woods had changed the way they saw the world. It made them believe that even small actions could uncover something big. The story of Michael Travers became something people told newcomers in Norwood when they wanted to explain what the town had been through. It wasn't told like a scary mystery anymore. It became more of a reminder, a quiet lesson about courage and persistence. Even as years passed, people still left flowers near the courthouse plaque. Someone every year on June 17th left a single white envelope beside it with a note that said, "Still remembered." No one ever saw who left it, and maybe that was the point. One winter evening, as snow began to fall, Linda visited the lake cabin for the first time in years. She stood by the frozen shore looking at the quiet water reflecting the gray sky. She didn't cry this time. She just smiled and whispered, "You did it, Michael. You finished what you started." She left a small lantern burning on the windowsill before she drove away. The detective eventually retired. People sometimes asked if that case had been the hardest of his career. He always said yes, not because of the mystery, but because it reminded him how fragile truth could be when surrounded by power. But he also said it restored his faith and persistence. One afternoon, years later, he received a call from a journalist working on a documentary about the Travers case. She asked him if he believed they had ever found the full truth. He paused before answering. "I think we found enough," he said softly. "The rest doesn't need to be written down. Some truths belong to the people who lived them." The documentary aired months later, bringing new attention to the case. But it wasn't sensationalized. It focused on Michael's courage, the community's strength, and how even small acts of honesty could lead to justice. It ended with a photo of Michael and Linda together from years before, smiling, carefree, long before any of it happened. The narrator's final words were simple. Sometimes the truth doesn't shout. It whispers, until someone is brave enough to listen. After the documentary aired, people from other towns sent letters to Norwood, thanking them for sharing the story. Some said it gave them hope to speak up in their own situations. Others simply said it reminded them that good people still exist. And just like that, Michael Travers's story, once buried, once forgotten, became a symbol of truth for people far beyond Norwood. The forest eventually grew thick again, hiding all traces of what had happened. The mine entrance collapsed fully and was covered by moss. But every summer, children still played near the stream, skipping stones and laughing, never realizing they were standing on the ground where one man's fight for truth had once begun. The detective, now older, sometimes visited that place quietly. He never told anyone. He would just stand there, close his eyes, and listen to the sound of the running water. To him, it didn't sound like just water anymore. It sounded like a promise, because that's what the story had become. A promise that truth, no matter how long it's hidden, will always rise again.